Question: do you think the Permian Pompeii formation in China is good evidence for deep time evolution?
Okay, a little bit. I actually know what this. I don't know if you've come across this formation, John, but I remember doing it. It was new in the news when I was doing my undergraduate degree. You've basically got what is claimed to have been a forest, a fossil forest, which is growing, a forest which is growing, which is producing peat in a swamp, and the peat is supposed to eventually build up into coal, and we've dealt with that many times. Then the idea is that there was a big volcanic eruption like Pompeii, which came down and basically fossilized all of the forest and trapped the peat beds, which ended up turning into a coal-like kind of substance called ligite. So a few comments from me, and then I'll throw open some comments from you and the rest of the team, John, because you've probably experienced this kind of sort of phenomena elsewhere. Number one, as we've already discussed many times on the program, you do have an issue if you're trying to argue that these are forests which are forming in a swamp, which are forming peat, which is to go on to form coal. Namely, you can go to swamps today, as Glenn and I did, and there is no peat forming. Secondly, you can go to actual peat bogs, like the ones in Ireland or Scotland, and you find that they are riddled with roots and thick mud kind of accumulation, which is coming together, which is nothing like these coal beds that you see underneath this ash layer. Now, there's no doubt about it, it's an ash layer, right? It is Pompeian in that sense that you've got this ash which has come down and covered a huge area, but the forest underneath is not a forest, it's a flood dump, because you do find plants there for sure, but you find them buried next to fish, right? I remember reading the report of some of this, and they were puzzling over how you get fish fossils there, because the one thing you do is one thing you realise is the only fish that were buried in Pompeii were the ones in the local fishmongers. And so you've actually got to try and get the water and the plants together into a mass ready to be buried before you actually have the volcanic eruption in the first place. Again, go back to the Bible, right? You've got a global flood. Flood washes over the land, brings the fish and the plants together, dumps them all in a huge mass, and at the same time you're going to have tectonic activity, you're going to have catastrophic volcanic activity, and you're going to have lots of these dumps. In fact, there's a huge ash dump which runs through the middle of Tennessee. You took me to visit there, John. So you see ash in the geological column or in the geological record quite abundantly, and there's no issue with that fitting that into a flood. So it's certainly no evidence of deep time, and there's certainly no evidence of evolution because you have living fossils in there. Any comments, John?
If you want to see the similar situation, just have a look at some of the work that we've done. Craig will be leading a field trip down to this area when he returns from central Queensland and heads back down. I'll be joining him for the first part of that. So what you'll find is we have volcanic ash beds with fossil trees, many vertical, usually without roots, and layers of coal all up the tree. Catastrophic depositional Pompeian in effect, but you'll find that the sort of scenario proposed, slow growth in a peat bog. Sorry, if you look at, as Joe said, look at the peat bogs around the place. The best peat bogs I've come across are in places like Scotland, where it's really cold, right? Or up in Alaska, where you do not get the forests growing in the peat bog, particularly when you look at Australia, where we've got pine trees. Pine trees, A, don't grow in the bogs. B, we're not talking about your pine trees that you've got some in Florida, where they grow in the bogs, but they don't produce peat. So what you'll find is we've got no evidence of anything like this situation in the world except by catastrophic sudden deposition. Rapid burial of pine because they rot really quickly, rapid burial of the peat because it will degrade quickly, and all the above. So no, the Permian formation there in China is no help to deep time whatsoever, and probably don't need to talk about that anymore, except to remind you that we have studied or particularly myself, the coal seams in Tennessee, carboniferous, as the British would say, or when you look in the USA, they give them a different name because they were in rebellion against the King's English, etc. But what you find is in those coal seams, I have closed lamellibranchs and brachiopods and trilobites in the coal itself. So no evidence of of a single swamp type deposition washed in for sure. Probably enough on that, Joe.
I think so. Yeah. And just one final brief, very quick, just comment. Right, we were having a. I think it was something that Answers in Genesis was hosting a Zoom meeting with me, right? And there was a number of critics that came on, and they started asking very, very specific questions, right, about very, very specific locations in very, very specific geological context, right? And the amazing thing was, I was able to answer it relatively comprehensively, even though I didn't really know where they were talking, because the way that they described it, you see these features across the world. Right? That's why we encourage you to get out there and actually dig up the real world, dig up the real fossils, because you find that the same pattern, the same flood that produced the patterns all over the world produced those same patterns. So anyway.